The cold wind swept off the Atlantic as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson disembarked from the steamship at Boston Harbor. The year was 1885, and while Holmes had agreed to a brief respite from his usual cases, neither he nor Watson were accustomed to idle time for long. The bustling harbor, filled with the scent of salt water and the distant cries of seagulls, was far from tranquil. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the scene, absorbing every detail. The crew unloading cargo, the ships anchored tightly in place, and the waves that lapped against the wharves like the subtle murmurs of a long-forgotten secret. Quite a contrast to London, isn't it, Holmes? Watson remarked as he adjusted the collar of his overcoat. The cold here seems to bite deeper, more insistent. Holmes gave a faint, distracted smile. The city may have its charm, Watson, but I find Boston's peculiar atmosphere rather fitting for the task ahead. Watson raised an eyebrow, but before he could inquire further, a familiar figure approached them. Inspector Lestrade, looking more harried than usual, strode across the dock toward them. His eyes, typically full of routine frustration when dealing with Holmes's unconventional methods, were filled with something else now, something deeper. His footsteps quickened. "Holmes, Watson, thank heaven you're here." Lestrade greeted them with a tense smile. Holmes's expression remained unreadable, but his keen sense of deduction immediately began working. Noting the state of Lestrade's appearance, the crease in his brow, the slight twitch of his left hand. Something was amiss. "I trust this is not a mere social visit, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice cool yet polite. "What brings you to Boston?" Lestrade hesitated for only a moment before speaking in a low voice. "There's been trouble at the harbor. Strange things, unsettling things. I thought of you the moment I heard." Holmes's interest was piqued. He motioned for Lestrade to continue, and the inspector glanced around as if ensuring they were not overheard. Then he spoke, his voice dropping further. "Ghosts." Watson chuckled in disbelief, but Holmes's sharp eyes remained fixed on Lestrade. He motioned for the inspector to explain. "Several sightings," Lestrade continued, his face tense. "It started a fortnight ago. Sailors on the docks have reported seeing a figure, dressed in tattered clothing, moving across the harbor at night. They say the air grows unnaturally cold when the figure appears, and some have sworn they heard a mournful wail. Do they claim the ghost has been seen at any particular time?" Holmes inquired, his tone now filled with that familiar urgency he reserved for a case that demanded his intellect. "Always after midnight, near the old wharves," Lestrade replied, his voice tight. "No one knows who or what it is. Some say it's the spirit of a lost sailor. Others whisper about it being the ghost of a ship that went down years ago. And the reports?" Holmes asked, glancing sideways at Watson, who had remained quiet, his curiosity now thoroughly engaged. "Are they consistent?" "They are to an extent," Lestrade answered. "The descriptions vary slightly, but all speak of a figure sometimes shrouded in fog moving with eerie purpose. But there's more. Just last night, a ship was found drifting aimlessly in the harbor, its crew missing. No trace of them has been found, and they had been docked just hours before." Holmes's expression darkened. "And you believe this to be more than mere superstition?" Lestrade hesitated, then nodded. "There are no signs of foul play, no evidence of a fight, no indication that the ship's crew abandoned their vessel in a hurry. It's as though they disappeared into thin air. There are also whispers of a treasure. Some say that a fortune was buried beneath the old docks long ago. Could the ghost be trying to protect it? I don't know, but it's enough to make the city uneasy." "I see," Holmes said, his voice quiet but firm. He looked out across the harbor, watching the ship sway gently in the water. "I shall need more details, Lestrade. Take us to the scene of the most recent event. I will begin my investigation there." Without waiting for a reply, Holmes turned on his heel, striding purposefully towards the harbor's edge. Watson exchanged a glance with Lestrade and followed swiftly behind. As they made their way through the maze of wooden piers and warehouses, the air grew colder, the fog thicker. Watson could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickle, as if the very atmosphere were charged with unease. He glanced at Holmes, who was walking ahead, his mind clearly already racing through the possibilities. "Do you believe in ghosts, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice low. Holmes did not look back. "No, Watson. There is always a logical explanation, even when things seem inexplicable. This ghost, if it is indeed what they claim, is merely a clever ruse. But why a ghost? Why now? Watson persisted, his voice filled with doubt. Because, Watson, the minds of men are far more susceptible to fear than reason, Holmes replied, his voice cool and unwavering. Fear is the most effective tool for manipulation. And someone here knows it. Lestrade led them to a large warehouse near the water's edge where the most recent ship had been found drifting. The building was dark, with only the faint glow of lanterns casting long shadows across the floor. The harbor sounds, the cries of the gulls and the gentle lapping of the water seemed muffled, swallowed by the fog that had rolled in like a blanket. This is where they found the ship last night, Lestrade said, his voice grim. The crew were scheduled to disembark just before midnight, but when the officers arrived to check the ship, it was already adrift. Holmes knelt beside a pile of cargo that had been left in haste. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned crates or broken equipment. The dock was eerily still. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he scanned the surroundings, noting every minute detail, the faintest traces of footprints in the wet wood, the slight disturbance of the dock's surface where something heavy had been dragged. He stood slowly and turned to Watson. This is no ghost, Watson. Whoever is behind this knows exactly what they are doing. Lestrade looked bewildered. But how can you be sure? Holmes's gaze swept across the harbor, his mind working rapidly. A ghost would leave no trace. No footprints. No tangible evidence, and certainly no signs of a methodical plan. Whoever is behind these events has orchestrated this with precision. Watson's curiosity only deepened. But who would want to create such fear? Holmes's eyes flickered as he looked towards the sea. The answer lies in the past, Watson. There is more to this harbor than meets the eye. Someone is hiding something valuable. As they made their way to the edge of the pier, a faint sound caught Holmes's attention. A soft, almost imperceptible scraping noise from the shadows. He held up a hand, signaling for silence. The three men stood motionless, waiting. The fog thickened, and for a brief moment the harbor seemed to hold its breath. Then from the darkness ahead a figure emerged. Shrouded in tattered clothing, its face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, the figure moved with uncanny speed, slipping between the shadows like a wisp of smoke. Holmes's eyes locked onto the figure. There, he muttered. The ghost, or whatever it is, makes its move. Without hesitation, he dashed forward, Watson and Lestrade close behind. The figure disappeared into the fog, but Holmes was quick to follow, his senses sharp as ever. Every step was calculated, each movement precise, as if the game had finally begun. Holmes's pace quickened, his silhouette vanishing into the dense fog that clung to the harbor like an old secret. Watson, breathless but determined, followed closely behind, his boots slapping against the wet boards of the dock. Lestrade's footsteps, a step behind, grew more hesitant, but his desire to uncover the truth seemed to fuel him as he, too, pressed forward. The figure ahead moved swiftly, its form barely visible through the thickening mist. Holmes's keen eyes were trained on every shift of the fog, every slight movement in the distance. As they neared the end of the pier, the figure suddenly stopped, turning to face them for the first time. For a fleeting moment, Watson thought he saw the glint of something metallic in the figure's hand, but it vanished just as quickly. "Holmes, do you see that?" Watson whispered urgently, though his voice was almost lost in the wind. Holmes held up his hand to silence him. His eyes narrowed. "Wait." The figure remained motionless, standing at the edge of the dock as if contemplating whether to flee or confront them. Holmes's gaze was fixed on the shadowy outline, his mind working furiously. It was then that he noticed something peculiar. The figure was not walking toward them, but standing as if waiting, its posture too deliberate to be that of a frightened person. The faint glimmer of a lantern light flickered from a nearby warehouse, casting just enough illumination for Holmes to spot the edge of a long coat, the billowing fabric fluttering with the wind. Holmes moved with the utmost precision, his every step calculated. He reached into his coat pocket, producing his magnifying glass with a quiet flick of his wrist. The figure, seemingly sensing their approach, turned abruptly and began to retreat further into the fog, its movement quickening as though it knew the game was afoot. "Stay close, Watson," Holmes muttered. "We are closing in." Watson, although still unsure of what they were chasing, nodded and quickened his pace. Lestrade was now only a few feet behind them, his brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and confusion. The figure seemed to glide through the fog, its movements too fluid to be of a natural human pace. Holmes, ever the skeptic, could not shake the feeling that this was no mere act of superstition. It was calculated, deliberate. The chase took them through narrow alleyways and down forgotten piers, until they reached an abandoned dock where the fog was thick enough to obscure even their own shadows. The figure had disappeared from view. Holmes halted suddenly, scanning the scene with his practiced eye. "It is no ghost, Watson," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "This is no spectral manifestation. Someone is hiding, someone with a purpose." Watson felt a chill in the air, the lingering tension almost tangible. "Then what, Holmes? Who would have gone to such lengths?" "That," Holmes said with a slow exhale, "is the question." A few moments passed in silence, broken only by the faint lapping of water against the dock. Holmes crouched, his fingers skimming the wet wood, tracing the marks on the floor. The faintest disturbance in the planks caught his attention, a subtle indentation in the wood, as though something had been dragged recently across it. He stood quickly, his eyes bright with realization. "The person we seek is no phantom," Holmes continued, his voice filled with a sudden intensity. "We are chasing a man, or perhaps a woman, who knows how to disappear into the shadows." Lestrade stepped forward, his brow still knitted in confusion. "But how do you explain the reports of the ghost, Mr. Holmes? What of the ship that went adrift last night? That was no trick of the eye." Holmes took a deep breath. The ship, Lestrade, was not abandoned out of fear. There was no ghost that sent those sailors fleeing. No, the real motive was far more pragmatic. Someone forced them to leave, and not by any means supernatural. Watson's mind whirred as he thought back to the missing crew and the unaccountable circumstances of their departure. "So this ghost is a cover for something else?" "Precisely." Holmes's gaze flicked back to the mist ahead, his mind working tirelessly. "And we shall find out what that is." As they turned to leave, a strange sound broke the stillness, a soft rustling from behind a nearby stack of barrels. Watson tensed, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his side. Holmes, ever the calm observer, took the lead, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man dressed in the same dark, tattered clothes as the ghost they had been following. But this was no ethereal wraith. This was a man, his features now illuminated by the faint glow of lanterns further down the dock. His face was pale, almost ghostly in appearance, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, and filled with something much more human. Fear. "Don't come any closer," the man said in a gravelly voice, holding up a trembling hand. "I have nothing to do with the disappearances." I was only trying to warn them." Holmes stepped forward, his expression inscrutable. "You were trying to warn them, were you?" The man nodded, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Yes, there's something terrible hidden beneath these docks. Something people were never meant to find." "Who are you?" Lestrade asked, his voice now firm with authority. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between them. "My name is Charles Whitmore," he finally muttered. "I'm a sailor, I should say. I came to Boston years ago, chasing the stories of lost treasure. And I found something I shouldn't have." Holmes's curiosity was piqued. "And what exactly did you find?" Whitmore's eyes flickered nervously, but he seemed to gather his courage. "An old shipwreck, the Black Widow. It sank 100 years ago, and its treasure has been lost ever since. But there's a curse, a legend surrounding it. The crew didn't just die, they vanished, or so the story goes. And that's when I began to see strange things, shadows, whispers in the fog. And then there was that figure, the ghost." Lestrade frowned. "And you believed it?" "A ghost?" Whitmore's lips trembled, but he stood firm. "At first, yes. But now I think it's something far more dangerous. Someone's using the stories of the ghost to keep people away from the wreck, to protect something that's buried deep beneath the harbor." Holmes's mind whirred. "You believe this ghost is merely a cover to keep others from finding the wreck?" "I do," Whitmore said, his voice growing more frantic. "I've seen men watching the docks, men who aren't afraid of the ghost. They're after the treasure, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And you think you know who these men are?" Whitmore hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I've seen them, a group of wealthy individuals tied to the shipping industry. They've been investing in the harbor for years. They know the ghost story, and they use it to their advantage." "Who?" Lestrade demanded, his impatience growing. Whitmore swallowed hard. "The Thurston family," he said quietly. "They've been buying up docks and properties around the harbor. Their patriarch, Robert Thurston, is the one pulling the strings. He's been using the legend to scare off any competition, but I believe he's hiding something, a treasure, maybe even more than that. Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes gleaming with determination. We must pay a visit to Robert Thurston, Watson. He holds the key to this mystery. Whitmore's face paled. Be careful. Thurston is dangerous. If he's been hiding something for all these years, he won't let anyone, especially outsiders, get in his way. Holmes nodded, his thoughts already racing ahead. Indeed, but we will see just how much danger Mr. Thurston can be when faced with the truth. As the fog continued to roll in, and the figure of Charles Whitmore melted back into the shadows, Holmes's mind was made up. The game had only just begun. The answers were buried somewhere deep in the history of Boston's harbor, and he intended to uncover them, no matter the cost. With that, Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade began their journey toward Robert Thurston's estate, where, Holmes was certain, they would uncover a truth more dangerous and complex than any ghost story could ever be. Holmes's mind was already several steps ahead as he, Watson, and Lestrade made their way toward the Thurston estate, which lay on the outskirts of Boston. The evening had grown darker, and the fog had not lifted since they began their pursuit. Holmes's keen mind was filled with the many possibilities of what they had just learned from Charles Whitmore. There were far too many threads, too many inconsistencies, and far too many unanswered questions. Every new piece of information seemed to make the puzzle more complex. But Holmes was accustomed to complexity. What unsettled him more was the growing feeling that they were up against someone who had planned this entire ruse with meticulous care. As they approached the Thurston estate, the massive iron gates loomed in front of them, guarded by a tall stone wall that seemed to block out the rest of the city. It was an imposing structure, one that spoke of wealth and power. The house itself was nestled on a small rise, with sprawling grounds that seemed eerily silent. Holmes's sharp eyes took in every detail. The shutters on the windows were tightly closed. The trees on the estate swayed slightly in the wind, their branches creaking like the sounds of ancient bones. There was no sign of life. The place looked abandoned, yet something in the air suggested otherwise. It felt as though something important, something hidden, was waiting just beneath the surface. Quite the imposing place, Watson said, his voice betraying a hint of apprehension. Do you think we will find what we're looking for here, Holmes? Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the mansion, his mind working through 1,000 possible scenarios. I have no doubt, Watson. Everything we've learned so far points to Thurston as the key figure in this mystery. If Whitmore's story holds any truth, Thurston has been pulling the strings from the very beginning. And I believe he's been hiding something right under the noses of those who trust him. Lestrade cleared his throat. I've heard whispers about Thurston. Some say he's made his fortune by being ruthless in his dealings with others. Others claim he's been involved in all sorts of shady business. Land deals, shipping, the docks, anything that's worth a profit. Holmes's eyes flicked to Lestrade, his expression unreadable. Shady business indeed, but I suspect that whatever Thurston is hiding is far more significant than any mere financial dealings. As they reached the gates, Holmes paused, looking carefully at the locks. His fingers brushed against the ironwork, tracing the intricate pattern of the gates, and then moved to the surrounding stone wall. There was a slight indentation in the stone, and Holmes's sharp eyes caught the faintest glimmer of something hidden within the shadow. A hidden mechanism. Wait here, Holmes instructed quietly. He moved toward the side of the gate and began inspecting it more closely, his fingers working expertly along the edges. Watson and Lestrade exchanged glances but made no move to intervene. The sound of Holmes's quiet murmurs, the faint click of metal against stone, was all that could be heard in the silence. Moments later, Holmes stood back, a satisfied smile playing across his lips. The gate is not as secure as it appears. It seems Thurston's estate is not as well guarded as it would have us believe. Without another word, he pushed open the gate, and the three men proceeded onto the grounds. The house loomed above them, casting long shadows over the path ahead. They moved cautiously, aware that their intrusion could very well be noticed at any moment. The estate, despite its size, was strangely quiet. No servants scurried about. No distant sounds of conversation echoed from the windows. As they reached the front steps, Holmes paused, his eyes scanning the ornate double doors. His fingers brushed against the polished wood, searching for any clue, any sign that something was amiss. "These doors," Holmes murmured, "are designed to appear inviting. But if you look closely, you'll see that the lock has been recently tampered with. They're expecting someone." Lestrade gave a nervous glance back toward the gate they had just passed. "And I'm guessing it's not a social visit." "Not unless Thurston has an unusual sense of hospitality," Holmes replied dryly. "No, it is clear that our presence here is anticipated." With one swift motion, Holmes turned the handle of the door and it creaked open, revealing a grand hallway adorned with expensive tapestries and fine paintings. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Holmes stepped inside, his footsteps quiet but confident, while Watson and Lestrade followed closely behind. The floorboards groaned underfoot, as though they had not been walked upon in some time. Yet the house appeared impeccably well kept. It was a strange contradiction, opulent yet eerily still. They moved through the corridors, careful not to disturb anything. Holmes was methodical in his search, his eyes sweeping over every detail, every painting, every mirror, every crevice. Watson, however, had begun to feel an unsettling sense of being watched. The mansion's silence, coupled with the strange, oppressive atmosphere, made him feel as though they were intruding on a place that had long been abandoned to a dark secret. They came to a large study, its doors wide open, revealing a spacious room filled with dark wood bookshelves and plush leather chairs. There was a massive desk at the far end, its surface covered in papers and old maps of the Boston Harbor. A single lamp illuminated the area, casting a dim light that flickered as if the flame inside was struggling to stay alight. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes scanning the desk. He pushed aside a few papers, examining them with quick, expert movements. There were nautical charts of the harbor, notes scribbled in a hurried hand, and even a ledger of recent financial transactions, many of them linked to the docks and various shipping routes. "This is exactly what I was expecting," Holmes said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "Thurston's investments are vast. He has his hands in nearly every aspect of the shipping industry. But these charts, they indicate something far more troubling." Watson leaned over, his eyes falling on the maps. "What do you mean?" "These are just nautical routes." Holmes's fingers traced a series of markings on the map, leading to a specific point just off the coast, near an uncharted area of the harbor. "This area here," he said, his voice thick with suspicion, "it doesn't appear on most maps of the harbor. Yet Thurston seems to have mapped it out in great detail. This is no ordinary shipping route, Watson. This is the location of the Black Widow's wreck." Lestrade stepped closer, his eyes widening. "But that wreck is just a legend. Surely Thurston can't be involved with that." Holmes didn't look up. "The wreck of the Black Widow has remained a mystery for a reason, Lestrade. Whoever controls the treasure, it controls a great deal of power in this city, and the wealth associated with it could change the course of history." Watson's stomach turned as the implications of Holmes's words began to sink in. "You think Thurston has been using the ghost story as a distraction to keep others away from the wreck?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed, he's likely been involved in the hoax from the start, spreading rumors of a ghost to frighten off anyone who might investigate. And now it seems someone else has caught wind of it, someone who knows the treasure's true worth." As Holmes continued to study the desk, his hand brushed across a large, leather-bound book that sat to one side. His fingers hesitated before opening it, revealing page after page of meticulous notes. Each entry was dated, and as he flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. "It's all here," Holmes muttered, his eyes scanning the entries with growing intensity. "The records of every ship Thurston has dealt with over the years. And these dates, these match up with the ghost sightings." Lestrade leaned in, examining the entries for himself. "So, Thurston has been orchestrating this whole scheme to drive people away from the wreck and keep the treasure to himself?" Holmes closed the ledger with a snap, his expression hardening. "Yes, and we have no time to waste. Thurston has been hiding this treasure for decades, but I believe he's not the only one interested in it now. There are other players involved, and they'll stop at nothing to claim what's buried beneath the harbor." Watson felt a chill run down his spine as Holmes turned to face them. "It seems our next move is clear. We must find the Black Widow and uncover its secrets before someone else does." As Holmes's eyes gleamed with determination, the trio knew that the true nature of the mystery was about to unfold. What lay beneath the waters of Boston Harbor was more than just treasure. It was a dangerous secret that had been hidden for far too long. The air in the Thurston estate had grown thick with the weight of their discovery. Holmes, his mind firing on all cylinders, stood by the desk, his fingers drumming lightly against the surface as he processed the implications of the maps and the records they had uncovered. Watson and Lestrade stood nearby, each man lost in his own thoughts. The magnitude of what they had learned beginning to settle in. The wreck of the Black Widow, Holmes muttered to himself, is not just a ship lost to time. It is a key, and someone, possibly several people, are willing to do whatever it takes to control it. Watson looked over the maps again, his eyes lingering on the unmarked area of the harbor that had caught Holmes's attention. But how can we be sure that Thurston knows exactly where the wreck is? These maps might have been made from legends, just rumors passed down through the years. Holmes turned to face Watson, his eyes sharp with clarity. Legends, yes. But these aren't just myths, Watson. Thurston has been systematically buying up land around the harbor, making sure no one else can get near the wreck. This is no coincidence. He has been meticulously setting the stage for something, a treasure he intends to protect or perhaps even claim for himself. Lestrade, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. So you believe Thurston is the one behind the ghost story? But what about the men Whitmore mentioned? The ones who are also after the treasure? Holmes's gaze shifted back to the maps, his fingers tracing the unseen path that led to the wreck. I believe they are a secondary factor. Perhaps they are after the treasure for different reasons, or perhaps they are merely pawns in a larger game. But one thing is certain, Lestrade. We have been drawn into a web, and it is far more dangerous than we originally imagined. Watson could feel the tension in the air. They had been investigating the ghost sightings and the eerie disappearances for days now, yet they had only scratched the surface. Each new discovery seemed to lead to even more questions. But now they had a tangible lead. A map, a name, and a clear connection to Thurston's business dealings. It was time to put all the pieces together. Holmes, Watson began cautiously. If Thurston has been controlling access to the wreck, why hasn't he taken the treasure himself? Why would he go to such lengths to scare people away if he's not planning to claim it for himself? Holmes's lips twitched upward in the faintest of smiles. A reasonable question, Watson. And one that I believe will be answered very soon. I think Thurston is playing a much larger game. Perhaps he is protecting something far more valuable than gold or jewels. Lestrade frowned. Like what? A secret, Holmes replied with certainty. Something hidden aboard the Black Widow, something that, if revealed, could ruin everything Thurston has worked for. The treasure itself might be valuable, but it is the truth that he fears the most. It was a chilling thought. As much as the idea of hidden riches was alluring, it was the knowledge of what might have been buried with the wreck that truly intrigued Holmes. Something that had remained hidden for over a century, something that could change everything. Watson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. What do we do now? Holmes turned, his expression now more focused than ever. Now we visit the Black Widow. The words hung in the air between them like a promise, a commitment to uncovering the truth. But there was no time to waste. They had to move swiftly. Holmes knew that they were not the only ones aware of the wreck's significance. Others, like Robert Thurston, had their own interests at stake, and every second spent in deliberation was a second closer to someone else finding the wreck first. They left the Thurston estate without another word, making their way back to the harbor. The fog had not lifted, and the night was dark as though the very air conspired to conceal the truth. Holmes led the way with his usual confident stride, his mind already calculating their next move. The boat they would need was waiting for them, concealed in the shadows near the edge of the harbor. It was a quiet vessel, meant for stealth rather than speed, perfect for the task at hand. As they boarded the boat, Holmes instructed the crewmen to take them to the coordinates marked on the map. The sea, dark and unpredictable, stretched out before them, and the further they moved from shore, the more isolated they felt. The eerie silence of the harbor was broken only by the creak of the boat's hull and the occasional slap of water against the side. Watson stood at the edge of the boat, watching the dark water ripple around them. His thoughts drifted back to Whitmore's warning about Thurston's ruthlessness. Was it possible that they were heading into a trap? Holmes seemed confident, but Watson couldn't shake the feeling that danger was lurking just beneath the surface. "We'll need to be cautious," Watson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes glanced over at him, his face illuminated by the dim lanterns hanging from the boat. Caution is always wise, Watson, but action is sometimes necessary. If we are to uncover the truth, we cannot afford to hesitate now. Lestrade, who had been unusually quiet, cleared his throat. And if Thurston or someone else is waiting for us at the wreck? Holmes smiled faintly. Then we will deal with them when the time comes. But remember, Lestrade, it is not the person who acts first that wins the game. It is the one who acts with the most precision. As the boat glided silently through the fog, Holmes's mind raced. He was no stranger to danger, but this was different. This wasn't just a case of uncovering a simple crime. It was a race against time to uncover something that had been hidden for years. If Thurston had been manipulating the situation all along, they had no idea what he was capable of. The wreck of the Black Widow was close now. Holmes could feel it. They had nearly reached the coordinates indicated on the map, and the fog was beginning to clear, revealing a narrow stretch of water where the wreck was said to be located. The boat slowed, the crewmen maneuvering it with precision through the now tangled cluster of rocks and submerged structures. Holmes motioned for the boat to stop. "This is it," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The wreck should be somewhere below us." They peered into the water, which now seemed to glow faintly with an unnatural light. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting its reflection on the surface, illuminating the outlines of something submerged beneath, the wreck. Holmes reached for a rope, signaling to the crewmen to lower it into the water. "We'll need to descend carefully," he said. "The wreck might be partially submerged, but we don't know what kind of dangers might await us down there." Lestrade, who had been looking uneasy ever since they left the shore, took a deep breath and steadied himself. "I never thought I'd find myself chasing treasure in the middle of a haunted harbor." Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile. "That's the thing about mysteries, Lestrade. They rarely follow the path you expect." One by one they descended into the water, the cold shock of it hitting their bodies like a physical blow. Watson, though a competent swimmer, felt the chill seep into his bones as they made their way down, guided only by the dim light of the lantern. The wreck was now just a few feet away, its outline becoming clearer as they neared it. Holmes was the first to reach the wreck, his hand brushing against the barnacle-encrusted wood of the ship's hull. He paused for a moment, inspecting the structure, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. There was no ghost here, no supernatural force to keep them away. What they had been told was nothing more than a distraction, a clever ruse to keep curious minds at bay. They entered the wreck through a large hole in the side of the ship, which had been torn open years ago. Inside, the remnants of the ship's former glory were still visible: splintered wood, rusted metal, and the remnants of old crates, many of them now consumed by the sea. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and decay. Holmes led the way, his eyes scanning the area with methodical precision. He moved carefully, as if the wreck itself was a puzzle to be solved, a final piece of the mystery that had eluded them for so long. Every step was measured, every move deliberate. Watson, following closely behind, felt his heart race as they ventured deeper into the wreck. Whatever they were about to uncover, he knew, would change everything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Holmes came to a stop in front of a large, weathered chest, half buried beneath the rotting timbers of the ship. His hand hovered over it as if he were testing the very air around it. "This is it," Holmes said, his voice low with awe. "The secret of the Black Widow." As Holmes opened the chest, Watson's breath caught in his throat. What lay inside was far more than they had expected. Holmes's gloved hand hovered over the weathered chest as if the mere act of opening it would unlock a mystery far greater than they had anticipated. The cold seawater lapped at their legs, the dim glow of the lantern flickering uncertainly in the deep shadows. Watson felt a sense of foreboding creep into his chest. This moment, so long anticipated, seemed to carry an unnatural weight. The treasure of the Black Widow had remained hidden for more than a century, but something told him it was not just the riches inside that held the key to this mystery. It was what had been kept hidden, buried beneath the layers of time and myth. Holmes, his brow furrowed with concentration, slowly lifted the chest's heavy lid. The creaking sound it made echoed in the confined space, reverberating in the eerie silence of the wreck. As the lid opened fully, they were greeted with a sight that no one could have predicted. Inside the chest were not gold coins or jewels as they had all imagined. No, what lay before them was far more cryptic. The chest contained stacks of old documents, some yellowed with age, others still relatively intact, their edges crisp and sharp despite their apparent age. Holmes's keen eyes immediately recognized the significance of what they were seeing. "Letters," Holmes murmured, his voice a soft whisper in the stillness. "These are not the trinkets we expected, Watson." Watson stepped closer, his curiosity piqued despite the unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. He bent down, careful not to disturb the documents too quickly. The papers were bound with aged, frayed twine, their pages filled with dense, meticulous handwriting. It wasn't the treasure they had imagined, but this was something far more dangerous. Holmes reached down, his hands gentle yet determined, as he carefully extracted one of the topmost pages. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the contents with such intensity that Watson could almost feel the gears turning in his mind. The silence in the wreck deepened as Holmes read, his expression unreadable. Watson could feel the tension building as the seconds passed, each one more loaded than the last. "What is it, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice almost shaking with anticipation. Holmes did not immediately answer. His eyes lingered on the paper, then flicked to another, his mind digesting the information quickly. Finally, he looked up, his face grim. "This is no ordinary treasure, Watson," he said, his voice low and steady. "These letters are records, detailed, confidential records. They describe something far more significant than gold or jewels. What we have here are the final communications between a secretive group of individuals." "Who are they?" Lestrade asked, his voice strained with both confusion and awe. Holmes exhaled slowly, then looked down at the chest again. "The group behind this, they were not interested in riches. These letters detail a conspiracy, one involving some of the wealthiest, most influential families in Boston, including Robert Thurston's ancestors." Watson's mind raced. "A conspiracy? You mean this wreck was not an accident?" Holmes shook his head. "Not an accident, no. The Black Widow was deliberately sunk, and its cargo was far more than just precious metals. These letters reveal a web of deceit, covering land deals, shady maritime transactions, and most disturbingly, a plot to control the entire shipping industry in Boston and beyond." Watson felt a chill run down his spine. It seemed as though they were no longer chasing a mere ghost story or treasure hunt, but something far darker, a conspiracy that had its roots deep in the heart of the city's most powerful families. He glanced at Lestrade, who seemed equally overwhelmed. "But why bury all of this?" Lestrade asked. "Why leave this hidden in a shipwreck?" Holmes looked at him, his gaze piercing. "Because the information contained within these letters would have destroyed these families. They are a record of illicit dealings that have been swept under the rug for decades. Thurston's family, among others, has worked tirelessly to erase all traces of this conspiracy, burying it beneath layers of lies and deception. The wreck of the Black Widow was their way of ensuring that it stayed hidden." The weight of Holmes's words settled over them like a suffocating cloud. Watson could barely comprehend the full scope of what they had uncovered. It wasn't just treasure they had found. It was a secret that had been buried for over a century, and it was clear now why Robert Thurston and others had been so intent on keeping the wreck hidden. "This explains everything," Holmes continued, his voice steady but filled with quiet conviction. "The ghost story, the disappearances, the bizarre behavior of Thurston. He has been trying to control this information, to keep anyone from finding it." Watson stepped back, trying to process it all. "But why go to such lengths? What could be so important in these letters?" Holmes's eyes darkened. The information in these documents could destroy entire families, but more than that, it reveals a pattern that connects directly to the control of Boston's shipping industry. This conspiracy didn't just involve a few corrupt businessmen. It involved the very heart of the city's economic foundation. Lestrade seemed to catch on. "So Thurston and others have been hiding their tracks for years. They've manipulated the market, controlled land, and erased evidence of this for generations." "Exactly," Holmes replied, his face grim. "And now someone else has learned of it." Watson blinked. "Someone else?" Holmes's gaze turned toward the water, as if he could see something just beyond the dark, rippling surface. "Yes. Someone who understands the power of this secret and will stop at nothing to claim it." A sudden realization hit Watson, and his heart quickened. The other men Whitmore mentioned, do you think they know about this? Holmes nodded, his expression darkening further. I'm certain of it. They may have been after the treasure, but they have now realized that the true value lies in these letters. The information contained in them is far more precious than gold. Lestrade stepped forward, clearly shaken. But what do we do now? If others are after these letters, we can't just leave them here. We need to act before Thurston or whoever else gets wind of what we found. Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile, but it held no warmth. We will need to get these documents into the right hands. The authorities must be notified, but we must tread carefully. If Thurston, or anyone connected to him, finds out that we have these letters, they will do whatever it takes to ensure they remain hidden. The weight of the decision was not lost on anyone. The documents in their hands held the power to unravel not just one man's fortunes, but the very fabric of Boston's elite society. It was clear now that they were not merely trying to solve a mystery. They were about to expose a conspiracy that had remained hidden for generations. Holmes looked at Watson, his eyes gleaming with that familiar fire. Watson, we must act swiftly. There is no time to waste. With that, they began gathering the letters, careful to handle them with the utmost caution. But as they prepared to leave the wreck, a sudden noise froze them in place. The faintest sound of footsteps echoed through the ruins of the ship, followed by a low, guttural voice. They're here, Holmes said, his voice sharp, and we're not alone. Watson felt his blood run cold. The danger was no longer a distant threat, it had arrived. Someone had found them, and the real game was about to begin. The faint sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the sunken hull of the Black Widow. Holmes's keen ears immediately picked up the rhythmic cadence, signaling the approach of someone or something moving with purpose. The eerie quiet of the wreck now seemed almost oppressive, as though the very air had thickened with anticipation. Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade froze, their movements stilled by the sudden sense of danger that clung to the waterlogged timbers of the ship. The lanterns they held cast long shadows that flickered wildly on the walls of the wreck, distorting shapes and filling the space with an unsettling, almost ominous light. They've found us, Holmes muttered, his voice low but steady, as though he had anticipated this very moment. His sharp eyes darted toward the source of the sound, narrowing with focus. Prepare yourselves. Watson instinctively reached for his revolver, his fingers brushing against the cool metal, the weight of it grounding him in the present. Lestrade, looking uneasy but determined, glanced around, his gaze searching the murky depths of the wreck for any sign of movement. The sense of impending danger was palpable, almost suffocating, but Holmes remained as composed as ever. Who do you think it is? Watson whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft lapping of the water against the wreck's sides. Holmes's eyes never left the shadows. I suspect it's not one person. There are likely several involved, but I would wager that Thurston's people are the ones closing in on us. The others, the men Whitmore mentioned, they are after the letters. They'll stop at nothing to get them. The footsteps halted suddenly just beyond their line of sight. The air hung still, heavy with expectation. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the water, the creak of the ship's decaying timbers, and the soft, almost imperceptible rustle of fabric. Then, without warning, a voice cut through the tension, a low, gravelly voice that seemed to come from all directions at once, reverberating off the walls of the wreck. Holmes! The voice rasped. You've gone much too far this time. Watson's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, yet distorted by the hollow space around them. It sent a chill crawling up his spine. He instinctively looked toward Holmes for some sign of recognition, but Holmes's face remained an impassive mask. He didn't flinch, didn't show the slightest sign of surprise. Robert Thurston, Holmes said, his voice cold and even. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall and imposing, his silhouette framed by the faint light of their lanterns. Thurston stepped into view, his face grim and resolute, but there was something in his eyes, something dangerous, like a predator who had cornered his prey. I warned you to stay out of this. Holmes? Thurston growled, his eyes flickering toward the chest containing the letters. You don't understand the forces at play here. You have no idea what you've stumbled upon. Holmes didn't flinch, his eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded Thurston. I understand perfectly, Thurston. It's not the treasure you're protecting, is it? It's the truth. These letters, these records, they expose everything you've worked so hard to keep hidden. Thurston's face twisted with a snarl. You think you know everything, don't you? You have no idea what it costs to maintain the balance of power in this city. You have no idea what will happen if those letters fall into the wrong hands. Which hands would those be? Holmes asked, his tone laced with quiet derision. Yours? The ones that have been manipulating Boston's shipping industry for decades? Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near the revolver at his side. Watson could feel the tension building and his hand tightened around his own weapon. They were at a standstill. Thurston knew the stakes, and so did Holmes. But who would make the first move? You don't know what's at stake here, Holmes, Thurston said, his voice lowering into a growl. Those letters don't just reveal business deals and shady transactions. They expose something far worse. The city's very foundation is built on these secrets. If the truth comes out, it won't just ruin me, it will destroy everything. Holmes tilted his head slightly as though considering Thurston's words. You've spent your entire life hiding behind these lies, Thurston. But eventually, the truth always comes to light. Sooner or later, it will find its way to the surface, and when it does, you'll have nowhere to hide. Thurston's eyes flashed with anger. I've spent my life building an empire, Holmes, and I'll be damned if I let you or anyone else destroy it. In that moment, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The faint sound of water lapping against the wreck was drowned out by the pulse of adrenaline in Watson's veins. The situation was rapidly escalating, and it was clear that Thurston would stop at nothing to protect the secrets he had buried. But as Holmes and Thurston stood locked in a silent battle of wills, something else caught Watson's attention, a flicker of movement in the shadows behind Thurston. Without warning, several more figures emerged from the darkness. Their faces were obscured by masks, but their presence was undeniable. They were part of Thurston's network, his hired men, and they were clearly armed. Holmes, Thurston sneered. You've brought your friends along, I see. But it's too late. This little game ends here. The masked figures moved forward, their footsteps deliberate and menacing, closing the gap between them and the chest. Watson's hand went to his revolver, but Holmes raised a hand, signaling him to hold. This is not the time for violence, Holmes said calmly, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to make the very air still. You don't want to do this, Thurston. There's more at stake here than your personal fortune. Thurston's gaze flicked to the masked men, and for a moment Watson thought he might back down. But the glint of greed in his eyes told a different story. I've made my decision, Thurston said, his voice now filled with cold resolve. And I'm not going to let anyone, least of all you, stand in my way. With a swift motion, Thurston nodded to his men. The masked figures surged forward, reaching for the chest. Holmes's expression hardened, and in that instant he made his move. He darted forward faster than Watson had anticipated, his hand shooting out to grab a nearby length of rope. In one fluid motion, he swung it toward the nearest masked figure, catching him around the neck and pulling him off balance. The man crashed into the hull of the wreck with a grunt, and the others hesitated, momentarily thrown off by Holmes's quick action. Now, Watson, Holmes shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Watson didn't hesitate. He aimed his revolver at the nearest figure and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the wreck, and the man crumpled to the floor, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Lestrade, not one to be left behind, drew his own weapon and fired a warning shot, forcing the remaining men to take cover. In the ensuing confusion, Holmes and Watson pushed forward, trying to reach the chest before Thurston's men could recover. But Thurston was quick, his hand moving to his belt as he drew a weapon of his own. Holmes's eyes locked onto Thurston's, a silent understanding passing between them. The situation had escalated, and now there was no turning back. With a quick motion, Holmes dove toward the chest, grabbing the stack of letters and securing them in his grasp. Run, Holmes shouted to Watson. We need to get out of here. But as the words left his mouth, the ground beneath them shifted. The wreck, already precarious from years of decay, seemed to groan under the strain of the conflict. The water surged, and the structure of the Black Widow began to collapse. The timbers of the ship splintered, and a loud crack echoed through the air as part of the ceiling caved in, sending debris crashing into the water below. Lestrade swore under his breath as he grabbed Watson's arm. We can't stay here, we've got to move. Holmes, with the letters still clutched tightly in his hand, looked at them both. There's no time. The wreck is coming apart. We need to get to the surface now. As the ship began to disintegrate around them, the three of them made a run for it, pushing through the wreckage, dodging falling beams and shattered wood. Thurston's men were in disarray, trying to recover from the chaos, but it was clear they were losing ground. With a final surge of adrenaline, Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade reached the edge of the wreck, scrambling up the sloping sides of the sinking vessel. The surface of the water was just within reach, and as they pulled themselves free, the wreck of the Black Widow let out one final, groaning cry before it sank completely beneath the waves. Breathing heavily, they emerged onto the deck of their boat, the chest of letters still in Holmes's possession. Watson glanced back at the ruins of the wreck, his heart still pounding from the harrowing escape. They had made it just barely, but the danger was far from over. They had the letters now, but they had also made powerful enemies. Thurston was not the type to back down, and it was only a matter of time before he came after them again. Holmes, his face as composed as ever, looked at Watson and Lestrade. "We've won the first round, but this is only the beginning. We must take these documents to the authorities and expose everything." Lestrade nodded grimly. "And pray that we're not too late." The boat glided silently through the darkened waters, leaving the wreck of the Black Widow behind. But the shadows that clung to the harbor were far from gone. The game was still afoot. As the boat drifted away from the wreck of the Black Widow, the distant echoes of the collapsing ship still reverberated in Watson's mind. The air was thick with the tension of their narrow escape. He clutched the railing of the boat, his knuckles white, and watched as the dark silhouette of the wreck slowly disappeared into the abyss of the harbor. The city's distant lights flickered like ghosts, unaware of the secret that had just been uncovered beneath the waves. Holmes, still as composed as ever, held the chest of letters firmly in his grasp, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His mind was already working through the implications of their escape. Lestrade, breathing heavily but alert, stood beside them, his eyes darting nervously between Holmes and Watson. The urgency of their situation was palpable. They had barely escaped with their lives, and now, with the letters in hand, they were not only carrying the weight of a century-old conspiracy, but had also made powerful enemies. The men Thurston had sent after them would not be easily dissuaded, and the truth they now held had the potential to topple the very foundations of Boston's elite society. There was no turning back. "Holmes," Watson began, his voice strained but steady. "What now? We've got the documents, but I don't think Thurston will let us walk away so easily." Holmes's sharp eyes flickered over to Watson, his lips curling slightly into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "Indeed, Watson. Thurston will come after us, but it's not just Thurston we need to worry about. The others, the ones behind the conspiracy, will be watching closely. This was never just about protecting the treasure. It was about controlling power, and that kind of power doesn't surrender easily." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowed in thought. "So what's our next move, Holmes? We can't just sit here with these letters. Thurston will make sure we never get the chance to expose them." Holmes paused for a moment, considering Lestrade's words. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but his mind was already calculating their next steps. "We need to get these documents into the hands of someone we can trust, someone who has the resources to ensure they are protected, someone who can expose Thurston and his associates without fear of retaliation." "But who?" Watson asked, looking out at the dark expanse of the harbor. "Who could possibly take on a conspiracy this powerful?" Holmes's gaze drifted toward the distant shore, his eyes narrowed in thought. "There is one person who might be able to help us, someone with the influence to stand against Thurston and his network, someone who knows the stakes of this city better than anyone." Lestrade looked at him curiously. "Who?" "Mayor Thomas Green," Holmes replied, his voice steady and confident. "He has long suspected that there is corruption within Boston's elite, and though he's made few enemies among them, I believe he's the one person who can help us expose this conspiracy." Watson's eyes widened. "You think we can trust him?" Holmes's expression softened just slightly, but his eyes never wavered. "I have no doubt, Watson. He is a man of principle, and he has the resources to not only protect us but also ensure that these documents reach the right hands. We must get to him before Thurston does." Lestrade, though still uneasy, nodded. "If you say so, Holmes. But we don't have much time. I can already feel the weight of Thurston's men closing in on us. We need to act quickly." Holmes nodded in agreement, his eyes sharp with purpose. "Prepare yourselves. We're going to Boston City Hall." The boat made its way swiftly across the harbor, cutting through the dark waters with a steady hum. The city's skyline loomed ahead, its towering structures bathed in the soft light of gas lamps. The atmosphere, once serene, now felt charged with a sense of urgency. Every shadow seemed to conceal a hidden threat. Every creak of the boat's hull a reminder of how precarious their position had become. The night felt heavier now, as if the weight of the conspiracy was closing in around them, its unseen hands tightening their grip. As the boat approached the dock, Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the shore, assessing the situation with a precision that only he possessed. They needed to move quickly but carefully. Thurston's men would likely be watching every point of entry, every road that led to City Hall, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. The moment they stepped onto solid ground, they would be vulnerable, exposed. "Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice low but commanding. "Take the rear. Watson, stay close to me. We'll move quickly but quietly. We cannot afford to draw attention." The boat came to a stop, its hull gently scraping against the dock. Without a word, they disembarked, their footsteps soft against the wooden planks. The night air was cold, and the streets of Boston were eerily quiet, save for the occasional clatter of a passing carriage or the distant murmur of voices. Holmes led the way, his steps sure and deliberate, his eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. They moved swiftly through the shadowed streets, avoiding the main roads where they might be spotted. Holmes's knowledge of the city was unparalleled, and he expertly guided them through narrow alleys and hidden passageways that led directly to the steps of City Hall. The building loomed before them, a symbol of the city's power and authority, its stone walls stark against the night sky. As they approached the entrance, Holmes held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. He motioned to a side entrance, partially concealed by ivy. "This way," he whispered. They slipped through the side door, entering the dimly lit corridors of City Hall. The air inside was musty, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Holmes's eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, as if expecting someone to jump out at them. But the building was deserted, at least for the moment. They moved quickly, their hearts racing as they made their way through the maze of hallways. Finally, they arrived at the mayor's office. The door was ajar, and through the crack, they could see a figure seated at the desk, his silhouette illuminated by the soft light of a desk lamp. Holmes didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open gently, stepping inside. "Mayor Green," Holmes said, his voice calm but urgent. The man seated at the desk looked up, his expression unreadable. Mayor Thomas Green was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face weathered by years of public service. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his sharp eyes seemed to miss nothing. He regarded Holmes and the others with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Holmes," Mayor Green said, his voice deep and measured, "I wasn't expecting you tonight. What brings you here, and why the urgency?" Holmes stepped forward, placing the chest of letters onto the desk with a quiet thud. "I need your help, Mayor. What's inside this chest could change everything about Boston, its power structures, its future. We need to make sure this information gets into the right hands before it's too late." Green's eyes flicked to the chest, his expression hardening. "What is it, Holmes? What's so important that you've risked your life to bring it to me?" Holmes leaned forward, his voice quiet but filled with intensity. "A conspiracy, one that goes back a century. Thurston, his family, and several others have been hiding something. Something that could destroy the foundations of this city if it's exposed. These documents are the key." Mayor Green didn't flinch, but his gaze grew more serious. "I've suspected for a long time that there's something rotten in this city's upper echelons. But this is more than I imagined." Holmes nodded. "I don't expect you to take this lightly, but you're the only one who has the power to make sure these letters are used properly. The people behind this conspiracy will stop at nothing to keep it buried. We need to act quickly." Green's fingers brushed the edges of the chest, his face darkening. "You're asking me to go up against some of the most powerful families in Boston. If they catch wind of this—" "They will," Holmes interjected, his voice firm. "But we have to move faster than they do. We have no choice." Green exhaled slowly, clearly weighing his options. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he nodded. "I'll help you, Holmes. I'll make sure these documents are delivered to the right people who can protect them and the truth they hold." Holmes exhaled in relief, though his mind was already turning to the next step. "Thank you, Mayor Green. You've made the right choice." As they stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on them, there was a sudden noise, A soft shuffle outside the office. The three men froze. Holmes's eyes snapped to the door, his senses on high alert. Someone was coming. Mayor Green's face tightened. "It's them, isn't it?" Holmes didn't reply, but his hand moved to his coat, fingers brushing the handle of his revolver. The door creaked open slowly and a shadowy figure stepped inside. "Thurston," Holmes muttered under his breath. The game was far from over. The door creaked open further, and in the dim light the figure stepped into the room, his presence as imposing as it was expected. Robert Thurston. His face was a mask of cold determination, but there was something else in his eyes, a mixture of fury and desperation. Behind him, two of his men lingered in the doorway, their eyes scanning the room for threats. It was clear he had come prepared, but the surprise on his face suggested that Holmes had anticipated his arrival. Thurston's gaze fell on the chest of letters still resting on Mayor Green's desk. For a brief moment there was silence, a heavy, suffocating silence before Thurston spoke, his voice low and venomous. "You really thought you could get away with this, Holmes?" he sneered. "You've meddled with something far bigger than you could possibly understand. These letters aren't just documents, they're a weapon, and now you've made yourself the target." Holmes didn't flinch. Instead, his eyes locked with Thurston's, unwavering and unyielding. "You've underestimated what the truth can do, Thurston. You've spent years building your empire on lies and manipulation, but the truth always finds its way to the surface." Thurston's hand hovered at his side, his fingers brushing the holster of the weapon concealed beneath his coat. His men flanked him, watching the room with calculating eyes, waiting for the signal. Mayor Green's voice broke the tense silence, though his words were far more measured than anyone expected. "Thurston, I've had enough of your games. If you think you can continue to manipulate this city, you've made a grave mistake. The people of Boston will know the truth, and I will make sure of it." Thurston's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of doubt in them now, just a glimmer of fear. He had always thought he could control everything, but this time, he was facing an enemy who wouldn't back down. "You don't understand what's at stake, Green," Thurston said, his voice tinged with something close to panic. "You think these letters will bring change? You think the truth will set you free? No. The people behind this, they've been in control for far longer than you realize. If these documents go public, the city will burn." Holmes's voice was calm but cutting. "You've already burned enough bridges, Thurston. It's over. Your empire of lies is crumbling." Thurston's eyes flicked toward his men, his fingers twitching toward his gun. "I will do whatever it takes to stop you, Holmes," he spat, his voice trembling with the weight of his words. For a split second, everything seemed to pause, the room, the air, the very heartbeats of the men standing in it. Then, without warning, the tension broke. In a flash, Holmes moved. His arm shot out, grabbing the chest of letters and shoving it toward Mayor Green. "Get it to the authorities," he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. Now, without waiting for a response, Holmes lunged at Thurston's men, knocking one of them back with a swift strike. The second man reached for his weapon, but before he could draw it, Watson was already in motion, his revolver raised and fired in a single, practiced motion. The man dropped, his weapon clattering to the floor. Thurston, now furious, drew his own gun, but the delay was enough for Holmes to close the distance. In a heartbeat, he disarmed Thurston, sending the pistol skittering across the floor with a swift kick. The mayor, standing frozen, finally seemed to realize the weight of the situation. He reached for his own weapon, but Holmes stopped him with a sharp gesture. "Don't waste time, Green. Get the documents to the right people. Now." The mayor nodded, his face tense with resolve. He turned, clutching the chest to his chest with one hand as he headed for the door. But as he reached for the handle, he stopped, glancing back at the two men still standing, Holmes and Thurston. Holmes looked at Green. "Don't let anyone stand in your way. This is your city. It's time to take it back." Green nodded grimly, pushing open the door and disappearing into the hallway. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the corridor, leaving behind only the tension of the standoff. Thurston, kneeling on the floor, his breath ragged and his face twisted with frustration, glared up at Holmes. His men were down, his plan in ruins, and now, with the letters gone, it seemed as though the conspiracy he had worked so tirelessly to protect was on the verge of collapse. "You think you've won, don't you?" Thurston seethed, his voice a venomous hiss. You've only begun to scratch the surface. There are others, people far more powerful than you realize. You've made a dangerous enemy. Holmes, his face unreadable, leaned in close. It's not about winning or losing, Thurston. It's about exposing the truth. And you've already lost. Thurston's eyes burned with hatred, but Holmes knew it was over. The documents were now in the hands of those who could use them to bring down the criminal network that had held Boston in its grip for far too long. The truth was out there, and no matter how hard Thurston or anyone else tried to bury it, it would not be silenced. Holmes turned to Watson, who was still catching his breath from the brief scuffle. "Let's get out of here, Watson. We've done all we can." As they walked out of the office, leaving Thurston in the dust of his own making, the sounds of the city seemed to rise up around them. The fate of Boston was no longer in the hands of the corrupt elite. The truth would have its day. It was a long, quiet journey back to the docks where they had first set out on this wild chase. The harbor was still, the moon casting a pale glow over the water, but it felt as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The conspiracy was exposed. The players had been unmasked, but there was still the question of what would come of it all. Would the truth really change anything? Watson glanced at Holmes as they boarded the boat, the weight of the night's events hanging heavy between them. "Do you think this will change anything, Holmes?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with doubt. Holmes looked out over the harbor, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, Watson. But the truth is a force in itself. Once it's set in motion, there's no stopping it. It may take time, but it will find its way." As the boat sailed back into the night, Holmes leaned back, his mind already racing ahead. The case was over, but the implications were far from finished. They had uncovered the truth behind the Black Widow, and they had exposed the web of deceit that had been hiding in plain sight for so long. But in the end, Holmes knew that this was just another case in a long line of mysteries. The world was full of secrets waiting to be uncovered, and as long as there was a mystery to solve, Sherlock Holmes would be there to find the answers. And so, as the boat cut through the quiet waters of Boston Harbor, the mystery of the Black Widow came to an end. But the truth, like the ever-moving tide, continued to shift, unstoppable and relentless.